Hey everyone! Well, you made it. This is the very last video from ECON 380, and in this video, we're going to be concluding our discussion on monetary policy by talking about monetary targeting and broader how it affects monetary policy. The Fed usually, as we talked about, has this dual mandate with two big goals, but they use intermediate targets to try and meet these goals. And these intermediate targets are now typically interest rates. So the Fed tries to use intermediate targets with these interest rates to achieve a larger objective. Like price stability. And these intermediate targets can only be indirectly controlled because households, firms, and investors will always influence them. So, notice that I said that these are typically interest rates, and this is a little bit of an interesting anecdote. The Fed no longer tries to track M1 and M2 as an intermediate target because starting in 1980, we call it the money aggregate experiment. And we ended up finding out that the relationship between money supply and inflation started to break down. So when you look at the chart below, it shows the growth in M1 in a period and then the inflation rate 2 weeks later. And as you can see, there's very little relationship. In fact, in the highest rates of M1 growth, one of them also had extremely high inflation 2 years later, and then one of them had extremely low inflation 2 years later. So, because of that, the Fed stopped using M1 and M2 supply as an intermediate target. But the Fed generally follows what's called the Taylor rule to try and use as guidance for the federal funds rate target. And the Taylor's rule is just a guideline for determining what the federal funds rate should be, and it works in most times. And that's why, if you remember all the way back to our discussion on the Dodd-Frank Act, the Congress actually tried to force the Fed to always use the Taylor rule as guidance. However, that isn't always the case. If you look at the graph below, you can see that if we had followed the Taylor's rule in 2010, we would have seen a target federal funds rate of negative 3%-ish. So not always perfect, but gives a decent baseline, as you can see generally, especially during healthy economic times of how the Fed conducts policy. And just in equation one, you have what the Taylor's rule is. It just uses inflation, the real Fed funds rate, the inflation gap, and the output gap as inputs to try and mathematically calculate what the Fed funds target should be. Now, inflation targeting is pretty interesting because in 2012, the Fed formally announced that it would target an inflation rate of 2% per year, which was the first time ever the Fed had publicly announced what we were alluding to with our discussion on the dual mandate, which is that inflation at about 2% is healthy. And the Fed, that being said, can still use discretion to address special situations, which is why right now we have inflation of over 3%, and the Fed isn't really acting aggressively to try and curb in that inflation. And there's a few reasons to support this action. First, it draws public attention to what the Fed can do and is doing, because otherwise, if all these objectives and targets are kept to the FOMC, it may seem like the Fed is just kind of doing whatever they want. It also establishes a transparent target for and provides inflation expectations for long-term loans. So it helps settle down the long-term loans market because once again, when you have steady inflation, you can have steady interest. It also promotes accountability for the Fed because it gives us a good, consistent benchmark on how the Fed is doing. Because, if inflation's substantially lower, substantially higher, then it makes you pause and think, like, why is the Fed doing this, and are they doing a good job at controlling for this target? It also potentially adds another monetary policy tool because in the future they could just change their inflation target and thus dramatically shifting the long-term interest rate expectations landscape. But there's also opponents to inflation targeting. For example, numerical targets diminish the flexibility of monetary policy because, in times like COVID, where just everything that we think we know about the financial system are starting to break down. The Fed shouldn't be shackled by some strict objective. Additional monetary policy affects inflation with a lag, so it can cause uncertainty in the reliance of forecasts. If you get a bad forecast from one of your employees, then you're going to make bad policy decisions, and we're not going to really find out up to like 2 years later. So it puts a lot of unnecessary weight on forecasts. It also uh, makes the job of elected officials harder because if the Fed isn't reaching this inflation target, then there may be cries to try and restructure the Fed, which adds a lot of pressure on elected officials because they can't just remove Jerome Powell. It also creates uncertainty about future levels of output because we're so shackled by inflation, and that ends up hurting decision making because if we're shackled by this inflation level, it we could see huge fluctuations in output. And then finally, it could just be potentially destabilizing to the economy when we're shackled to inflation. And so, because of that, the Fed heard some of these concerns and responded to a few of them by slightly altering the 2012 target so that it now reads as an average inflation rate of 2% over time. So instead of an annual inflation rate, it's an average inflation rate. So, we had extremely low inflation last year, so we can accept a little bit higher inflation this year and still be fine because the average inflation is still at about that 2% mark. That being said, let me know if you have any questions on monetary policy or are interested in anything you heard or read or anything else, frankly, in this class. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed these videos and good luck on your final.